Thanks very much. One of the themes that has been present in a number of the presentations at this meeting that I've observed is that training is necessary but not sufficient for achieving research integrity. That we also need to attend to the cultural constraints, the norms of expectations, the incentives that drive researchers' behavior. And simultaneously, we have to take stock of the constraints on individuals, humans, to act on their intentions. That we may have the ideals of doing science with integrity, with approaching the values of science, and yet not be able to follow through on them, not because of insufficient intent, but because our minds are constrained in ways that don't allow us to act on our intent. I am a faculty member at the University of Virginia, and our laboratory investigates the gap between values and practices. What we think we should do, what we'd like to do, what we want to do, versus what we actually do in our everyday behavior. And the Center for Open Science is actually a spin-out from the laboratory that's a practical application of that interest, the gap between scientific values and scientific practices. So what I want to do is give you a taste of both of these interests, what our lab works on in terms of the constraints on understanding our own minds in driving our human behavior. We study mostly implicit bias, thoughts and feelings that occur outside of awareness and control, and how those shape how we see and understand and act in our environment. And then talk very briefly about how those general principles of the constraints on our minds need to inform actual behavioral change interventions for improving integrity. So let me give you this context experientially about how we don't have complete access and control of our own minds. And this is a very simple task. All you have to do is listen to this fellow say a syllable. But what I want to have happen is everybody on this side of the room, look down, look away, don't watch the screen as he speaks. Everybody over there, watch him as he speaks the syllable. I'll play it a couple of times to make sure that everybody can hear it. Here it comes. Oops, we need the sound. We'll try it again. Sound ready? All right, here we go.
Ba, 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 ba.
I'll play it again.
Ba, 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 ba.
Okay, by show of hands, who heard ba, ba? Who heard da, da? Anybody hear ga, ga? Okay, anybody freaking out right now? Right? You should be, so do this yourself. Watch him, don't watch him, watch him. And the sound that you hear in your head will be different as a function of whether you're looking at him or not.
Ba, 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 ba.
I'll do it again.
Ba, 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 ba.
So we don't have time to get into the psychology of this deeply. The point of doing this demonstration is that we experience in our minds what we think is reality, but it is not. There is reality, and our experience of reality is filtered through a number of physiological cognitive mechanisms that construct that experience for us, to try to figure out what's going on out there based on the information available to us through our sensory systems. But it's using heuristics, using assumptions, using past experience, lots of things to help make interpretations of that information. What we're getting here is competing bits of information. When you're not looking, the sound being played is ba, ba. But the visual information is ga, ga, how his lips are moving. And when we integrate those, we do it completely non-consciously, the experience of da, da emerges, even though that never happened, right? And it's a sensible interpretation given some of the linguistic elements here. We'll skip that. But the point is, we never experience the conflict between this information. We never experience the sensory integration. All we have as our conscious experience is the flow of understanding, of hearing it in a way that makes sense. And we have lots of things that are active behind the scenes that are helping give us a simple experience of the world. And these things act very quickly for us because they're very efficient. They allow us to absorb and understand the environment very quickly, but then they impose constraints on how we see that environment next. So I'm going to show you this very easily by showing a picture of an animal very briefly and then taking it away. All you have to do is try to see the animal as quickly as you can. It's going to be on there for like less than a second. Here it comes. What was it? Who says horse? Who says frog? Anybody see both? It's both. So here's the thing. I'm going to put it back up on the screen, and I want you to first see the one you didn't see first the first time. And I'll tell you right now, you cannot do that. You will see the first one you saw the first time first. What I want you to also notice is how much longer it takes you to see the other one, right? It wasn't hard to see the first one. It was practically instant, probably, that you recognized it as a horse or a frog. It will take you more time, perhaps only a second, perhaps many seconds, to undo the perception that you've now already imposed on that. Here it is. So if you're having trouble seeing it, this is the bottom if you want to see the horse. This is the mane, this is the snout. This is the bottom if you want to see the frog. This is a lily pad, these are the haunches, this is the head. So if you had the experience that most do looking at this, it was very easy to see it the first time. We form an impression and we impose that interpretation on this information. And for our minds, that's great. We now understand what this is. It's a horse or it's a frog. Right? But once we have that impression, it's very hard to undo. We have to actively change our impression of the information and in order to see it in a different way. And that extra work is something that the mind doesn't want to do, because once we feel like we have understanding of how something is, then we are done processing it. And so we can filter the world through the beliefs that we already have, the things that we already know about stuff, and we will be more likely to see things coming in as consistent with our pre-existing beliefs and ignore the things that are different than what we already know. So one more visual demo, and then we'll talk about the substance here. This is Ed Adelson's image of a checkerboard that he drew. He's a cognitive scientist at MIT. And the particularly important thing about this image is that the squares labeled A and B are the same shade of gray. Right? See that? Same shade of gray, one's labeled A and B. Does anyone perceive them as the same shade of gray? Right? Does anyone believe that they are the same shade of gray? Right? No one's believing. Okay, I'm going to show you that in fact they're the same shade of gray by pulling out of this and just taking this and then dragging it up, putting B on top of A. Yeah, or I'll drag it down and put A on top of B. Right. So you may be feeling very uncomfortable about this. You can come up and look at my laptop later and test it yourself if you don't believe it. I can also get rid of illusions simply by connecting them. Right? This is a profound illusion, and again, we don't have time to get into the psychology, but if you want to ask questions about it, happy to discuss why this occurs. But the key thing for our purposes is that the same thing can be experienced fundamentally differently depending on the context around it. B is surrounded by darker squares and is under a shade. And so our mind makes an adjustment and lightens B by comparison in order for the whole gestalt, the image as a whole, to make sense. A is surrounded by lighter squares and is part of the darker part of the checkerboard, and so is darkened by comparison. All of these adjustments are made mentally in order to make, and non-consciously, in order to make sense of this as an image. And that sense is delivered to our conscious experience. But if you are convinced that in fact they are the same shade of gray, knowing that doesn't change the perception. You don't now see them as the same shade of gray. I've been looking at this for 15 years. They still look like different shades of gray. I can't not see it that way because perception is not subject to reason. I don't get to decide how I experience the world. So all of that background knowledge, that information, that prior experience, all the things that I have gone through in my life shape how I see today, and I can't experience it in another way, even if I know that it's wrong. Even if I know there are other things that I would need to do in order to see it accurately and objectively. And we ask scientists to be objective about the world, but we do so without recognizing the constraints that they have of their own minds to enact that intention, that value. And we also have discussed many sessions at this meeting, the cultural constraints that scientists are in, which is my success as a practicing researcher depends on me getting it published, not on me getting it right. The values of openness and reproducibility are values that I can say, I can endorse, I believe in, but they're not functionally relevant to my advancement in my career, getting my job at my institution, getting it through a journal into publication, getting the next grant. right? Those rewards are dependent on lots of other things. And we can recognize those norms of science, the values of science. Merton talked about those, and there was a fabulous survey that Anderson and her colleagues did in 2007 that shows what the norms of science are, right? Openness, sharing, skepticism of our own results, disinterestedness, just trying to figure out the truth, versus the counter norms, which are largely careerist, right? Promoting our own interests, not necessarily the interests of science. And when Anderson and her colleagues surveyed researchers saying, which of these do you endorse, the norms or the counter norms, what they show in gray here are the proportion of the respondents that said we endorse the norms over the counter norms. 90% or more of early career, postdoc level, mid-career, people in their first R01 awards, these are all NIH awardees. Not more, 90% of people saying, I endorse the norms of science on average more than the counter norms. And very few percent in black saying that they endorse the counter norms over the norms. Then they follow up and say, okay, don't tell me what you endorse. Tell me how you behave in your everyday research. Looks like this, right? Still 60% of people are saying, I behave according to the norms of science the best I can. Still very small proportion saying they behave more according to the counter norms. Then they say, okay, don't tell me what you do. Tell me what the other people in your research area, what do they do, right? Looks like this, right? So there is this context of almost everyone saying, I believe the values of science. I try to operate by the values of science, and the field around me does not support that, right? Does not act the same way, right? And here is that scenario of the culture seems to reinforce just advance career at all costs, right? Get the next publication, get the next grant, drive one's own career. Do the things that are in your interest, not necessarily those that are in the interest of science, right? And simultaneously, it illustrates the bias blind spot. I can't see those biases in myself. I can more easily see them in others, right? And that is a real challenge for achieving openness and reproducibility in science, because fundamentally, we have a psychological conflict of interest. There are many things that happen in the lab where certain kinds of behaviors are good for me, good for advancement in my career, but not necessarily aligned with what's good for science. And so one of the things that we need to do in shaping how it is we incentivize science is attend to the fact that that culture needs to align those values, those norms, with what's actually rewarded in researchers' everyday behavior. And if those aren't aligned, all the training in the world will not change behavior, because I may know what I need to do, but there's no value in me doing it. And I may not even have the wherewithal, because I don't understand the constraints of my own mind, to recognize when I'm behaving in a biased way that I don't know. Right? So here are a few examples, just to illustrate some ways that are informed by the constraints on one's minds for how we can enact change and allow researchers to live by the values that they already express that they have. They're just not incentivized to behave by. So one is very simple, signals. Let's find ways to signal behaviors that are desired behaviors. Add badges to articles when researchers make their data openly available in a repository, when they share their materials, when they pre-register their research designs, right? If we provide just simple signals that any journal can adopt and use, then maybe researchers will have some incentive, more than zero, for actually following through on making their data available. There's a way to signal that I am a researcher that believes in openness and that I'm following through on that. So the journal Psychological Science adopted badges on January 1st, 2014. They are the black line, and the comparison journals are in gray. Prior to adoption, about 3% of the articles in Psychological Science had open data. A year and a half after adoption of badges, 39% of the articles have open data in independent repositories. Right? For a badge, right? It's a tenfold increase because of a badge. Right? That is not because badges are amazing. It's because the values are already there in the community, and we just need to signal when the behavior is happening. It's very simple psychology. Soumya and others have already mentioned the top guidelines. Can we define standards, right? Just make explicit what it is to be an open and transparent and reproducible researcher, and have those described in such a way that they apply very generally, applicably, across disciplines. That was the main target of the top guidelines. And a key part of the top guidelines is recognition that different disciplines are at different places with a lot of these initiatives that we have been discussing at this meeting. Open data, lots of fields are talking about open data. Pre-registration, a couple of fields are talking about pre-registration. And a variety of different barriers and opportunities between different fields. So the top guidelines are modular so that adopting the top guidelines does not mean universally adopting every piece. It means giving options for which of the 8 different standards in the top guidelines one wants to adopt. And those guidelines have different levels of stringency, from disclosure to requirement to verification. And that adaptability gives us a template, a framework that any part of the discipline can adopt, either a journal or a funder or an institution, to have a common language around what it means to live those values and how those values translate into practice. And then provide stepping stones. If fields start to get into pre-registration, then there are ways in which those can get stepped up over time. And there's a variety of different organizations. Many now have added themselves as signatories and are in the process of adopting top guidelines that are appropriate within their communities and interests. One more example that has been mentioned a couple of times is registered reports. And this is thinking about how do we structure processes that will increase the likelihood of reproducible findings at the end, decrease publication bias and reporting bias and selective reporting, but simultaneously integrate into the existing incentive systems. Don't require researchers to do a whole new thing. Instead, fit in with what they're incentivized to do now and enable some of these practices. So this is the cartoon version of how research works, right? You design a study, you collect and analyze data, you write the report, and then you publish it. But of course, there is that barrier of peer review that happens too late for me to do my science just as accurately as I can, right? If all of the review for getting the reward that I need, publication, is after I've written the report, then all the incentives are to make that report as novel, as beautiful, and as tidy, as positive results as possible, not to just report it as I found it. So all of those incentives are making the report as publishable a unit as it can be. So the simple change in registered reports to the incentives is just to move review to the design after the design phase. So I submit to the journal the research question and my methodology. This is how I'm going to investigate this question. This is why it's an important question. This is why we need to know the answer. Now my incentives, if I can get an in-principle acceptance from the journal at this stage, my incentives are ask the most important questions that I can with the most compelling methodologies that I can. The results are the results. I'm not supposed to control those anyways. That's what I'm supposed to learn in doing the research. The incentives shift for me as a researcher, as an author. They also shift for the reviewers. Now reviewers say, this report is messed up and these are all the reasons why, and so don't publish it. When the reviewers can have impact at the design phase, they can actually make suggestions that can actually change the way the research is done, can improve the research. And so it's much more collaborative between the reviewers and the original authors in producing the best possible science that can be done. So this has a lot of potential positive impacts. We have 52 journals now that are offering registered reports as an option, Nature Human Behavior being one of the recent additions to that. And it is a very nice complement to the traditional process of doing research. Now, you may have lots of quick objections of, wait, in discovery science, how does that work, and blah, blah, blah. Let's talk about that in Q&A. I want to just finish. So 2 more points, and then I'll close. One is that pre-registration is a hot topic of discussion and still emerging as a topic of practice in a lot of different disciplines. Researchers are interested in it, but don't yet have the tools, the workflow, the knowledge to think through how pre-registration might be relevant for their research. So we started the Pre-Reg Challenge to try to give an initial incentive as an education and awareness campaign. So researchers can enter the Pre-Reg Challenge. They go through a guided workflow that educates them about pre-registration, gives them the information about how to pre-register their research, what information is needed. And then if they end up publishing the results of a pre-registered study in an eligible journal, they can get $1,000. And we're giving 1,000 of those awards. So we put $1 million aside to provide awards for people to get some practice with pre-registration. And our hope is that this becomes a habit. Once one pre-registers and sees the value in their own workflow, integrating this into how they do their work, then they won't want to not do it. because they'll see so much benefit in clarifying what is the purpose of this study in advance and being very clear about what is the confirmatory aspects and where are we just exploring, where we are looking for discovery. We don't know what to expect in this particular line of inquiry, so we can be very explicit that that's what we're doing in that phase of the research process. Okay, those are some incentives. So I want to close with what mostly our organization works on, which is technology. We have a staff of 60 now, about 40 is the software development team. So the incentives are trying to provide those resources so that researchers can live by their values. The infrastructure team is building all free public goods infrastructure to make it easy. How do I do it? Well, here's some tools to help make it happen. And the basic principle for all of this is two simple things that we learned when we were 6 years old, right? Show your work and share. If we can achieve those two things in science, it'll be fine, right? Because the scientific process is a process of communication about ideas. You seed ideas into the marketplace, people argue about the evidence, some of those ideas survive, and knowledge is advanced. But it requires having insight into how it is those ideas have an evidence backing. The report itself isn't enough. It's advertising for the research. What we need is access to the data, the content, the process by which that particular claim was made. And that will really enable the self-correcting nature of science, the free market nature of science, as it were, for trying to parse through ideas and advance new knowledge. So our main work to try to support this is the Open Science Framework. This is a free infrastructure for project management that meets researchers where they are today, right? Solves a problem that researchers have right now, which is I lose my own data and methods and materials for my own work, right? Because the lab has people going in and out. They're ad hoc systems. A lot of the systems are local for how that information is preserved. So we provide a cloud-based solution that people can use privately just for their lab project management, right? I need a place where my data will never go away if a computer explodes or a postdoc explodes. It'll always be there. And so the OSF provides that, right? Private workspaces to manage one's data and materials for all the different projects. But it makes it trivially easy to make any part of that workflow public, right? Just a click of a button, and then are you sure you want to make this public? And then another click of a button. And then different parts of that research process are public, and it integrates the private and the public workflows. So our lab management, how it is we're doing our studies, is managed, and then parts of that are made publicly accessible for others to see. And the key part of this is that with an API at the center, the OSF is connecting the different services that researchers use around the entire research lifecycle. These are the ones integrated so far, and there's a number of others that we provided grants for different groups to connect their services. The goal is to make researchers more efficient in getting around that research lifecycle by making it easier to transition between the different services they use, but to use the services that they want to use. They may have a particular repository that they like. They can use OSF as a repository, but they may use Figshare or Amazon Web Services or Box.com or Dryad or many other kinds of services. So they can connect those. They start a project, they connect their GitHub account, their Dryad repo, their Dataverse, their Mendeley sources. All of those being connected into a same environment reduces the friction for them getting around their research lifecycle, but as a byproduct, dramatically improves reproducibility. We can trace the process by which they got to the findings that they got to, and make sure that all of that process is archived and preserved in an effective way. So we offer this as an individual service. Researchers can just sign up and start using it. And there's an institutional option. So if you want to try to advance availability of these kinds of services at your institution, you just email us and we can set it up so you can get single sign-on with their institutional credentials, et cetera. So there's lots more to say about that, but I think I'm about at time. So I'll just close with some links. We build exclusively free public goods infrastructure. We are a service-based organization, nonprofit with a mission to increase openness, integrity, and reproducibility of research. And so any way that we can provide value to you and your community in advancing openness and reproducibility, that's why we exist. So please reach out to us, and we're happy to provide the help that we can. Thanks very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much for this thought-provoking and inspiring talk. There is a question, please go ahead.
Yeah. Brilliant talk. But I have a feeling that you're actually dealing with a subset of science which goes on in academia, where you don't have the exigencies of work that's done for companies and research organizations. I spent time in companies and in government research institutes, and the things that we were doing were basically governed by the fact that we either were able to make a product or we were not.
Yeah.
Either we were able to increase the yield of a virus or we were not. And we were regulated, in essence, by the outcomes of the researches that we were doing and the significant. Very little of that work is published.
Yeah.
And the companies don't want it published. They don't even want you to tell anything about what you're doing. So to some extent, I think we're looking at a microcosm of a macrocosm. 80% of science is funded by industry or by commercial organizations of one sort or another, and is regulated by their success in the marketplace at the end of the day, and you can't run away from that. I mean, no matter how you report it, you either make the product or you don't, you make it efficiently or you don't, you get your money back or you don't. So don't you think that we need to expand what you've been saying and incorporate a different way of looking at the way in which we come to determining the reliability of what we're doing?
Yeah, this is an excellent point because there are, and this largely, as I present it, the role of publication as a key incentive is an academic key incentive, right? If you're in other contexts where there's another incentive, which is the product needs to work, the bridge needs to stay up, the skyscraper can't fall out, whatever it is, if the outcome matters, then that's the driving incentive, right? But in academia, if your findings are wrong, what does it matter? I got it published, right? So this is where the incentives are off for that researcher. So I totally agree with the point. It's great suggestion. Yeah. In terms of funding. Right.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we would deserve some coffee. Yeah. Thank you very much.